What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Airguns channel, and welcome back to another episode of Airguns 101. Today, we're not talking about airguns. We're talking about scopes. We're just going to cover some basics, the anatomy. Why can't I say anatomy? We're going to cover the anatomy of scopes, the parts, what they do. We're going to go a little bit into what you get with different price ranges. And first, I want to start off by a little clarification. Some people think that you can't put, normal rifle scopes on air rifles because they will damage them. And that's partially true. It depends on the air rifle. And as far as the air rifles that we sell, you can put any scope on them because we don't sell Springer air rifles. The reason you can't put a high-end scope or any normal scope on a Springer is because they have crazy recoil and vibration, and I won't go deep into it because we're going to do a whole video on it later on, which will be pretty interesting, so keep an eye out for that. All right, guys, a lot of you probably aren't subscribed right now, so just do that real quick. It takes half a second so that you will know when we post more informative videos or just good killing entertainment videos. Moving on, I'm just going to jump into the anatomy of a scope. I'm going to start with a more basic kind of mid-tier scope, and starting at your eyepiece, you have what's called a diopter. This is basically what you use to focus it to your eye. What I like to do is put it on max magnification, and I like to look at the sky, something that's clear, and I'll just move this in and out to focus the reticle to my eye, so that reticle is super crispy. So moving up, you have your magnification adjustment or your magnification ring, whatever you want to call it, and this does exactly what you'd expect. It adjusts your magnification. Now, a bunch of scopes will have this, and they will all have their own magnification range. This is a 4 to 14, we've got a 6 to 36, and 4 to 16, and there's obviously much more different magnification ranges, and it just depends on your application and what you want to do with that scope. Moving up to the middle of the scope, you have your turrets. Lots of scopes will have 3 different ones. It depends on kind of the price range and the type of scope that you have, but on the top you have your elevation turret, and this one is capped, and we'll talk about turrets here in a minute. On the right, generally on the right, you'll have your windage, but there are scopes that have your windage on the left. So you have your windage turret, and then on the left you have your parallax adjustment. Parallax is, a lot of people just call it the focus, but what you're really focusing is your reticle to your target. You're kind of putting it on the same plane so that when you adjust your head a little bit or move in and out, your reticle isn't going to move. A lot of people will see a zero shift or an impact shift when their parallax is off because their head isn't in the same exact spot as when they zeroed, and parallax fixes that. So when you adjust your parallax to 100 yards and you're shooting 100 yards, you'll see that your impacts won't shift, and you'll notice that when it's not adjusted, your reticle will be fuzzy or your target will be fuzzy depending on what your eye is trying to focus on. So it all kind of just brings it into the same plane. And then moving down the scope, you have your objective lens, and they'll all be different sizes, and some of them can be different conical shapes, but a general rule of thumb is bigger means more light, and the same goes for your tube size. They will have different tube diameters, and a general rule for that is bigger is more light. So obviously the bigger the tube, more light can get through unobstructed, and the clearer the image. And scopes can be anywhere from 1 inch all the way up to a 36 mil or a 40 mil tube, so they can get pretty big, and those obviously there's some trade-offs. They'll be a lot heavier. So now that we've kind of covered the anatomy of the scope, let's talk turrets, what the turrets do, what they mean, and how you can kind of understand them a lot easier. Every scope will have the turrets, and a lot of them, lower end scopes, the turrets are there just to adjust the zero. You're only going to do that, you're not going to touch it after that because you'll have a clean reticle. There's no markings, it's just a center aiming cross that you put in the middle of your target. But with turrets that are exposed and have these markings on them, these markings will directly coincide with the markings on the reticle. So you can do 2 things when you're shooting distance or making an adjusted hold to shoot farther. You can, 1, adjust the turret. You can take whatever firing solution came from your old data or your ballistic calculator, you can put that into the turret, and then you hold center of your reticle, or leave your turret on 0 and hold in the reticle. So if I'm going to adjust, 4.5 on the turret, then I'll hold center. But if I want to make that same hold without adjusting the turret, I hold 4.5 in the reticle. So those are both measurements either represented in the turret or in the reticle. When I'm turning this turret, what's happening inside the scope, there's an erector, and when I move that turret to 4.5, it moves the center of my reticle up 4.5 mils or MOA, and we'll talk about those angular measurements here in a second. When I do the turret, it moves my reticle so that I don't have to hold in the reticle. When I keep it on 0 and when I hold in the reticle, I'm physically moving everything else to make that adjustment as per my firing solution. So it's pretty simple. Basically, you just have 2 rulers, measuring sticks in your gun. You have this one you can adjust to hold center, or you use the yardstick in your scope to make that adjustment. You'll notice a lot of the high-end scopes will have either a lockable or a capped wind turret. And I prefer a capped or a lockable wind turret. Some of them, like these lower-end scopes, when their wind turret will be just exposed and you can adjust it. But my general rule, when I zero the gun, after the gun is zeroed, I never touch my wind, because wind changes constantly and quickly sometimes. So I don't want to be dialing my wind. If I have a firing solution and it says, at that point in time, because the wind is 8 miles an hour, full value left or right, my wind hold is going to be 0.8. But I don't want to dial that on the turret because, 5 seconds later, it could be 15 miles an hour and my wind hold is now 1.8. So I like to hold in the reticle. My preference is I will dial my elevation because gravity is constant. My data for my gun is constant. That's not going to change, but the wind is. So I'll make that adjustment, and then I just make the wind adjustment. I'll hold either left side or the right side of the target, and I can use my Kestrel or just look at the wind indicators or feel the wind, and I can make those wind adjustments on the fly, because then I'm not chasing the wind with my turret, getting confused, making the wrong adjustment, and then moving to a target. Now there's no wind, it gets, it turns into a cluster really quick when you're adjusting wind in your turret and on a windy day, because it's constantly changing. So I prefer, you don't have to take this as gospel, but I prefer just to zero my wind turret, keep it that way, and hold. I talked about mils or MOA. To put it really basically, it's standard and metric. It's 2 different forms of measurement, and in the scope they are angular. It's an angular I'm just losing it. It's a way to measure angles, basically, because what I'm doing when I make this adjustment is I'm making a very small adjustment here, but that adjustment translates to downrange a much bigger adjustment.
Small adjust, make big downrange change.
When I get an MOA scope, a minute of angle scope, it'll say on the turret that each click is 0.25 MOA, or 1/4 of an inch. And it'll say at 100 yards. It'll say that either on the box or on the turret. So every time I move this scope 1 click, that translates to 1/4 of an inch at 100 yards. That's just your yardstick on your turret, and in your scope as well, on your reticle. Each one of those subtensions will either be 1 MOA, half MOA, or 1/4 MOA, and it's important to read your manual that comes with your scope so you know what those subtensions mean in the reticle. A mil is the other form of measurement in scopes, a milliradian. On this it says 1 click equals 1/10 of an MRAD. With MRAD, you're getting 1/10 mil adjustments at 100 meters. But an MRAD is about 3 inches at 100 yards as opposed to 1 inch at 100 yards with the MOA. But each click is a tenth of that approximate 3 inches. And I prefer MRAD just because it's in tenths. I'm dumb, so I need tenths to do the math, and it's just easier to make those corrections, saying, oh, you're 0.5, you're 0.3, instead of trying to say, oh, you're 1/4 or 3/4, and yeah, it's just easier for me. And in the competition in PRS and military world, mils is widely preferred and used. You've probably noticed that there's a pretty wide price range for scopes, and you probably wondered why some scopes cost upwards of $3,000 to almost $5,000 depending on the ones you look at. and some cost just over $100. We've got a low, mid, and high tier or high price scope, and they all have relatively the same features. So I'm going to tell you why the price difference is pretty drastic between the low end and the high end. What goes into the erector system is a big portion of that cost, because what you're looking for in a scope is repeatability. When I make an adjustment to shoot 1,000 yards or 200 yards with an air gun, you're going to make a big adjustment. You're going to raise that erector up quite a bit. So when I do that, I'm going to go probably over a full revolution on my scope into the second revolutions, and I want those measurements to track perfectly, because I got that data from my ballistic calculator and it told me to put that into the scope, and I want those measurements to be exact so that I don't miss. Another point is when I bring that back down to my 0, I want that 0 to be exactly where it was when I zeroed the gun. So I want it to go straight up and come straight back down. I don't want there to be any margin of error, so that when I come back down, my 0 is now a 1/4 inch high at 100 yards instead of where it was. So that repeatability is coming from the precision and the quality materials in the erector system of the scope. Most low-end scopes will track really well out of the box, but eventually there's going to start to be a small margin of error that could get bigger because of just normal wear and tear, and that tracking is going to start to kind of deteriorate. And that is where the higher end components come in the high end scope. So aside from just really good glass, better clarity, you're paying for a lot of that precision in the erector system. So with the super high-end scopes, you're also going to get much more precise clicks, which mean more precise adjustments. But I can go up and down, up and down, up and down on this scope for literally years, thousands of revolutions, and it will not lose any precision in tracking. So in a sense, you really get what you pay for. That's one of the reasons why scopes cost so much. Another reason is obviously glass. Good glass is expensive, and good glass doesn't limit the light that is going through your scope, because ultimately what you're trying to do with a good scope is you're trying to gather as much light as possible to project it onto your eye so that you can see the target better. Low-end scopes use cheaper glass. Cheaper glass can be foggy, it can be distorted. There's a whole lot of bad things that come with cheaper glass. And that's not to say that cheaper scopes are bad, because the technology has come very, very far. Cheap scopes right now are miles ahead of what they used to be. You can get a really nice scope for, under $400. But that technology also is going into high-end scopes. High-end scopes with good glass are insane. So I will say one thing, you will never regret saving the extra, 6 months to buy the high-end scope, because good glass is so nice. You'll never regret it. But yeah, that's why scopes are expensive. Good glass, good erector systems. There's a lot that goes into nice scopes, and you obviously have to pay for it. All right, guys, that is our episode of Airguns 101 on scopes. If you want a little bit more in-depth video on scopes, we also did one a while ago where we really deep dive into price ranges and, features and stuff like that. So go check that one out. Also, keep your eye out for the Springer versus normal rifle scope video, because we're definitely going to break stuff in that video. It's going to be pretty entertaining. But hope you guys liked it. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one.